Spoiler alert, Namor has a long and interesting history in the Marvel comics, which means that Namor has had his fair share of relationships, though he's not nearly as notorious a dater as Peter Parker is. Namor has been linked to several interesting characters, such as Sue Storm. What does Tena Chuerta think of the potential of that storyline? Let's take a look at Namor's reaction to Fantastic Four's Sue Storm romance prospects, and all of Namor's other romances in the comics ranked. But first, Namor actor reacts to Fantastic Four's Sue Storm romance prospects. With the introduction of Tena Chuerta's Namor into the Marvel Cinematic Universe in Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, an interesting storyline from the comic books that is tied back to the Fantastic Four has come to the surface, which could potentially even be explored in the future. While the ending of Black Panther 2 does suggest that we haven't seen the last of Namor, it's unclear when we can expect to see the Tolokan leader again, especially considering that Disney is legally blocked from developing a solo movie for Namor due to rights issues with Universal. But the comic book history of this anti-hero is truly vast, and there are many other ways in which the MCU could take Namor in the future projects. For example, Namor could take a shot at love. In the Marvel comics, Namor and Sue Storm have a complicated relationship, but one that could definitely be explored on screen. But how does Huerta himself feel about his potentially steamy plot point? When Rolling Stone asked the actor if he was looking forward to that particular plotline, he answered, quote, "I don't know what's in the plan for Namor in the future. Me, Tainich, as a person, I want to play this character many times, but it's not up to me." As mentioned before, Namor has been linked to several other characters, so let's take a look at all of Namor's romances in the comics ranked. Next up, starting with Namor and Marina, the relationship between Namor and Marina is a tragic one, and one which needs a trigger warning for how it ends. Marina and Namor started a romance together during her stay in Atlantis to recover. They fell in love effortlessly and even got married, something Namor can't take lightly because his wife would rule Atlantis with him. But tragically, a combination of Marina becoming pregnant and her unique alien heritage caused her to transform into an uncontrollable beast that is known as a Leviathan. In the end, Namor had to kill Marina with Black Knight's ebony blade, bringing their whirlwind romance to a terrible ending that really wasn't anyone's fault, but was painful all the same, as Namor does end up having to murder his pregnant wife. Whether she turned into a monster or not, this isn't a story arc that everyone is interested in or willing to sit through. Next up, Namor and Namora. There was a time in comic book history when it was suddenly relatively popular to team up male superheroes with a female version of themselves, like they did with Batman and the original Batwoman, and there was a moment in time when Namor had found himself a pretty new partner, a woman named Aquaria Neptunia, who was nicknamed Namora. So while heroes who work closely together and become romantically involved wasn't anything out of the ordinary at all, and having superheroes enter somewhat narcissistic relationships with female versions of themselves was actually popular, the relationship between Namor and Namora was kind of awkward to say the least. A little while after Namora's initial introduction, her original was actually retconned, making her Namor's cousin, and it was only after they were canonically related that they became romantically involved with each other. While it's not quite as bad as other, similar incestuous pairings within Marvel, like Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, Namor's relationship with Namora will always remain clouded by the fact that they are related no matter which way you turn it. Hold up, we're not done yet. Next, which one of Namor's girlfriends was so jealous she tried to kill Sue Storm? Which relationship couldn't decide between friendship and love? And which relationship lasted the longest? Stick around until the end of the video to find out. First up, Namor and Dorma. No matter what you think about the relationship between Namor and Dorma, their romance was meant to be off the charts, and canonically, Namor really did love Dorma. But when we take our rose-colored glasses off, it's hard to deny all the serious problems that Namor and Dorma had. Before they became a couple, Dorma was so uncontrollably jealous of Namor's attraction to Sue Storm of the Fantastic Four, she actually tried to kill Sue, which is a huge red flag, but apparently Namor wasn't too worried about it or the fact that Dorma had put his lover in mortal danger, and they eventually started dating. While this thankfully stopped Dorma from attempting other hits on Sue Storm's life, this wasn't the end of the problems with Namor and Dorma. As is usually the case when there were red flags like these, Later, Dorma was kidnapped and killed by an Atlantean named Lyra, who had the desire to become queen in Dorma's stead, as Dorma's murderous jealousy obviously wasn't a great start of their relationship, though it did offer some pretty accurate foreshadowing of how things might end. Fans aren't very likely to look back on this romance with a lot of fondness, or were you rooting for Namor and Dorma to work things out? Next up, Namor and Betty Dean. Betty Dean is easily one of Namor's oldest allies in the Marvel Comics. Just like Namor himself, Betty Dean's comic appearances date back all the way to 1939, which means that Namor and Betty Dean have an extensive shared history on the page. Unfortunately, this also means that some of the depictions of their relationship are inconsistent, not to mention questionable canonically. But even so, in some of the older comics as well, the relationship between Namor and Betty Dean seems to waver back and forth between romantic and platonic constantly. It's as if they're just not sure about what they want themselves, which just ends in an inconsistent relationship overall. Then further down the road in Namor, the First Mutant #5 by Stuart Moore, Ariel Olivetti, Brian Ching, Rick Ketchum, Don Ho, and Craig Young, it's blatantly clear that the relationship between Namor and Betty Dean is explicitly depicted as romantic, but that doesn't mean that their relationship in this particular depiction is good, with Namor disappearing for months at a time without ever saying a word to Betty Dean. At the end, it seems like fans are left to decide for themselves whether Namor and Betty Dean were great allies and friends, or maybe their relationship is a little bit more toxic than they're aware of. And now, Namor and Emma Frost. Emma Frost's most famous romance is obviously with her fellow X-Men member, Cyclops, and we're not here to say anything that makes their story any less valid, but it's quite possible that there are fans out there who are completely unaware of the fact that Emma Frost also had an on-again, off-again relationship with none other than Namor. When Namor and Emma first met as members of the Cabal, it was instantly clear that there was a very strong connection between the two, and their romance simply unfolded from there. And while this sounds like the perfect start to a Nicholas Sparks-style Marvel story, in the end, Namor and Emma's relationship became less of a relationship of its own and more a part of a love triangle with Scott Summers. Writers were very clearly a lot more interested in pairing Emma with Scott, and Namor ended up being framed more as kind of a distraction or temptation from the already established couple. Ultimately, this cheapened the romance Namor had with Emma, making it more about the drama than the instant connection that they shared, which some think could have been explored just a little more before returning to safer ground. Following Namor and Sue Storm, it's not hard to understand why Sue Storm would be attracted to Namor. In lots of ways, Namor is everything that Reed Richards is not. For example, Namor is passionate about lots of things, unlike the often cold Reed. A woman cheating on her emotionally distant husband with a hot merman sounds like it belongs in one of those steamy romance novels, but who's to say that it doesn't at least have the potential for it to create some really interesting conflicts? For one, Sue's involvement with another man could make for an interesting shakeup in the Fantastic Four status quo, and put some things in a harsh perspective. And while Sue does end up leaving Reed for Namor during Fantastic Four, Life Story #2, and there was this brief stint where the two ended up together when Reed was temporarily dead, it doesn't really go anywhere in the end. Maybe because there's also this slight hiccup of Namor having kidnapped Sue in the past. Anyway, it doesn't look like Marvel is very eager to create a steamy romance story with a member of their first family, but they can't take back what's already been done. And at last, Namor and Sandy Pierce. Most of Namor's relationships are relatively short, if desperately passionate, but there's one relationship that lasted longer than any of the others, and that's the one he had with Sandy Pierce. Namor and Sandy at the beach when they were still children, and at the time, Sandy had no idea that Namor was actually an Atlantean. They end up losing contact, but when they meet again years later, Namor and Sandy become romantically involved. At some point, Atlantis is forced to relocate, and Sandy decides to go with Namor, and then a strange thing happens. She is never really mentioned again. After this point, Sandy simply stopped appearing in the comics, and no explanation for her absence was given, leaving many fans to wonder what happened to her. Some think that Sandy just passed away from natural causes due to old age, given that Namor and Sandy met in the 1920s, but no one knows for sure where Sandy went. But if this is true, this would mean that Namor's relationship with Sandy lasted longer than any of his other romances, though it's quite tragic to think that he may have lost his his love to something as slow yet unstoppable as old age. And that's it. Which one of Namor's relationships do you think should have worked out? Please let us know in the comments below what you think. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.